Thank you very much, Commissioner McMahon. President Higgins, your wife Sabine, who else is here? Minister of State Kieran Cannon, very special welcome also to Louise and Adam. And then our two serving ambassadors, Liam McGann and Ambassador Strau. There are other ambassadors present as well, but all of us are here as friends, and so thank you very much for being here this evening. Mr. President, I've had two intense and wonderful days here in Dublin, and unlike others, many others in the room, I've not had the privilege of living in Ireland for any length of time. But from the moment I arrived and through all of this, I feel at home and I feel loved and I feel cherished, and that's very, very important. And I just want to say a big thank you for that. The fact that we're here at Kilmainham Jail for this wonderful exhibition on the life of the centenary of Nelson Mandela is fundamentally important, because being in this jail just reinforces, as you pointed out, Mr. President, our shared history. It's a history of resistance and a history that we sought to overcome. And in many ways, for us in South Africa, as you pointed out, on your visit to Robben Island in 2014, Robben Island represents that soul for us, but it's not the only place. In Johannesburg, there's a place that held many brave men and women, freedom fighters over many years, that was called the Fort, that now stands as a testimony to the human spirit. It is our constitutional court. Ahmed Gatrada, who was one of the Rivonia trialists, and in his life had visited Robben Island more than 300 times. Not 300 days, because he spent 20-odd years there, but subsequent to his release, he took so many delegations because the island represented so much of the soul of Ahmed Gatrada. He said of Robben Island, while we will not forget the brutality of apartheid, we will not want Robben Island to be a monument of our hardship and suffering. We would want it to be a triumph of the human spirit against the forces of evil. And I think the fact that we stand here today in a jail that had seen over Easter in 2016 14 freedom fighters killed is fundamentally important, because it's that link that brings us together in the way that you had tried to describe. The centenary of Nelson Mandela's birth, and 2 years after the execution of 14 men here, brings this together. Inasmuch as the exhibition is about Nelson Mandela, it is about a struggle. And it's very important that we focus on that life and that period of struggle. And as with President Higgins, I don't wish to do a précis of this wonderful exhibition. It would be undeserving of crash course this evening. But the way I look at the life of Nelson Mandela, and in fact the times of Nelson Mandela, I'm reminded of Shakespeare's 7 stages of man in As You Like It. The first stage of Mandela, from his birth in 1918 at Mveso in the Eastern Cape, to about 1944, when he was part of the formation of the African National Congress Youth League, was a period of learning, induction, and rebellion. That rebellion saw him leave the rural areas of the Eastern Cape, go to Johannesburg, and meet people who would always remain a fundamentally important part of his life. People like Walter Sisulu, who late in life Madiba still looked up to, and we looked up to Walter Sisulu as one person who could who could try and right the ship when sometimes Madiba was becoming a bit too enthusiastic about issues. But that was a relationship that started in the 30s in Johannesburg, and they were together involved in the formation of the ANC Youth League in 1944. The second phase of that life was a period from 1944 to 1960, which saw protest, it saw the building of a mass movement, it saw a series of issues that live on in our minds today. And Nelson Mandela's role in that period, I think, is one that we should always be reminded of. When in 1952, the African National Congress declared a defiance campaign, defiance of unjust laws, where white people would get on black trains and black people would go into white buildings, a period of defiance when there were arrests and imprisonment. Nelson Mandela was the volunteer-in-chief for the Defiance Campaign. The inspiration of the Defiance Campaign saw more and more campaigns. The Alexandra bus boycott, the potato boycott, well, that might be very sensitive to some Irish. But there were big campaigns that involved the messaging of the struggles of people, and the potato boycott was in fact the messaging of the hardship of workers on farms cultivating potatoes east of Johannesburg. A very important part of that period was, in 1955, the adoption of the Freedom Charter, not just as a single document, but as a voice of people that defined South Africa. It's a set of messages still reflected in our Constitution. The Freedom Charter begins with the words, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people." That spirit was a spirit that drove us, that inspired us, that lifted us, that held us together. It ends with that big declaration, "These freedoms we shall fight for side by side throughout our lives until we have won our liberty." The Freedom Charter speaks to that period. And in the wake of the Freedom Charter, the response of the apartheid regime was to pull together a massive treason trial. There's a wonderful photograph of the treason trialists upstairs. It was not a resolved trial, but it was designed to try and create some segue away from the struggle that had gained momentum. President Higgins spoke of Sharpeville and in its wake, when there was no choice, the decision to convene an armed struggle. Again, Nelson Mandela's words ring out as though he spoke it yesterday. There comes a time in the life of any nation when you are faced with the choice to either submit or fight. It was a clear choice. It wasn't one made premised on the need for violence. It was that all other options had been removed from the political space in South Africa. The next period, a very intense period between December 1960 and April of 1964, Madiba built the underground, built the Mandela Plan so that the country was organized, focused on the armed struggle, but more importantly, took forward a great leap in building African solidarity. He went from country to country, seeking support but mobilizing the togetherness as part of a fundamentally important Pan-Africanist movement. And on his return, he was arrested and charged, and there's that place at Howick, on the cover of your photograph, of your brochure, where he was arrested first. He was imprisoned and then brought to court, and it ends with that moment. We were here earlier today, Mr. President, and in that cell, and in the cell over there, the most remarkable thing that gives life to all of what Nelson Mandela represented. And it's that brave, bold statement from the dock. When every lawyer had said, there's only one thing that's likely to happen, and that's a death sentence. And he stared it down with a statement from the dock. And the fact that the Apartheid Museum is able to bring the loops of tape and play it in the voice of Nelson Mandela, I can't do justice to that big commitment. But it's a deep, profound commitment to stand in court when the prospect is the death penalty, and to declare what you believe in, what you fought for, and what you are prepared to die for. I don't think that history has any other examples of such boldness. But it was that inspired us, and there's a great moment, because another of his co-accused is Dennis Goldberg, and Dennis's mother was in court, and she couldn't hear so well. And as they were led down the steps to the cells below, she said to him, "Dennis, what is it?" He said, "Mom, it's life, and life is great." And it's a story that Dennis, he's one of the 2 Rivonia trialists still alive, tells with a lot of relish. The fourth stage of Madiba's life is the many years, 27 years he spent in prison, where he was meant to be forgotten. He reflects on the fact that what prison does is to take away control. It takes away agency from people, and he proceeded to mobilize in prison, and for a generation of which I am part, which is in South African terms called the 1976 generation. It was a big moment. People who went to prison after the Soweto uprising, people who went later after the 1980 uprising, were part of this movement. It was a movement educated by the likes of Nelson Mandela. It could never be forgotten, and his life in prison. You see, when P.W. Botha offered him conditional release, he refused. He said very clearly that a prisoner cannot negotiate with his jailer. And then he set a condition that he would not allow himself to be released until all the other Rivonia trialists were released first, and he wanted to see that they were home safe and well. And in those moments, I think he began to assume a different role, a different responsibility. The fifth stage of his life, if we're still on Shakespeare's 7 stages, is that period between the 11th of February 1990 and the 11th of May 1994, when he was inaugurated as president. There were so many things to do. There was an ANC to build from different strands of the underground, the exiles, and the mass democratic movement. There were exiles to be returned. There were political prisoners to be freed. There was location necessary for people who'd been away for a long time. There were negotiations that needed to be started. There was a presence in the global world, including visits to the support networks, including, as President Higgins pointed out, here to Ireland soon after his release. And then there was a particular moment which I'm glad is captured in the exhibition. In April of 1993, one of our great leaders, Chris Hani, was assassinated. And it felt right then that the country would go up in flames, and there was one television station that was a state-owned broadcaster. And the only person who could address the nation was, of course, the head of state. And Nelson Mandela called F.W. de Klerk and said to him, "President de Klerk, you must allow me to address the nation." And so on the 13th of April 1993, Nelson Mandela became the de facto president of the Republic. He addressed the country, he calmed the waters, he took responsibility in a way that changed the face of the country. Whatever happened after that was a matter of form. The sixth phase is, of course, his 5 years as president, his commitment to a single term that he saw through. And it was an intense period We needed to form government. We needed to take responsibility for things we did not know about before. We needed to craft a constitution, and it's a great constitution. We needed to start a process for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We needed to build new relations with the world as a newly found state. And we needed to understand what lawmaking was all about. All of that undertaken in the 5 years of his presidency. It was a truly remarkable period. And then the seventh and final stage is a stage from 1999 until he passes away at the age of 93. He didn't interfere in the work of government, but he was available as an advisor. He was available to the world. He did nudge and cajole, especially on some of the more difficult issues like HIV and AIDS. But we look back on his life and we see a leadership evinced by values, and very importantly, Nelson Mandela's ability to see further than anybody else. I happened to have been there on the 11th of February 1990, the day of his release. And in fact, the previous night we sat and looked at what he should say. It's his first speech. People didn't even know what he looked like. We didn't know how many people would arrive the following day. And he said, you must put into the speech that President de Klerk is a man of integrity. And we were too militant to accept that, but Madiba prevailed. It was going to be his speech. It was going to have his imprimatur. It was his. And so we had to insert that President de Klerk is a man of integrity. And he said it from time to time until one fine day, the 21st of December 1991, when CODESA 1 had started and de Klerk attacked the African National Congress, Madiba got up and he said, Mr. de Klerk, I have described you as a man of integrity on many occasions. I now withdraw that. And in other ways, it been able to demonstrate the same kind of clarity of vision, sometimes taking a hard line against the militants around. He wasn't the saint, and he made it clear from day one that he wasn't the Messiah either. But he played the role, and he played it with immense courage. One of the stories that will be told repeatedly about him is he was going to address a meeting in a little town called Beaufort West, about 450 kilometers from Cape Town in January of 1994. And there was an armed Afrikaner group called the Afrikaner Resistance Movement, or in the lingo, Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging. And they had about 90 people deployed to Beaufort West, and they were going to storm the hotel that Nelson Mandela was in. And he was briefed by a security detail, and he said, all right, okay, call their commander in. And a woman from Beaufort West who was in the hotel at the time says that she saw this commander going up with a khaki hat and an ostrich feather in the hat, bouncing up the stairs and coming back with his hat in hand and tail between the legs. Now, that kind of courage is not something that most people possess, but it was that inner strength, that inner core that guided and developed Nelson Mandela throughout his life. There was a wonderful book released just a few weeks ago called I Remember. And I Remember is actually not a book about big names, it's about little people who worked with Nelson Mandela. They were the cook at home, the person making tea in the office, the bodyguards who lived with him. They were clerks, and they all tell the story of a person who cared deeply, who would test their opinion on a range of issues, matters of state, who reached out to them, who included them, who didn't see race, gender, or social standing as a prerequisite to be tested. And all of them speak with amazing love and passion about the privilege that they've had of working with Nelson Mandela and being taken into his confidence. They speak of visits to their homes and visits to hospitals by the president to them when they were ill. They speak of visits when family members died. How he was able to compact all of this into a single life, I will never quite understand, but it made him that very special leader that we were so privileged to have, that laid the foundations for what we are today. So, I look above me, and we look in the exhibition here, and we look back on a life of a century. We look back at the struggles of the Irish people, and we understand what courage is all about, and we understand what Ahmed Kathrada speaks of when he speaks of the triumph of humanity against the forces of evil. That's what we look back on. We look around us in the world today and we see tyrants who have no regard for the rights of people, especially for the rights of the vulnerable, like immigrants. We see them carry on with gay abandon. We see them walking with iron heels across the multilateral institutions that were built in the wake of the previous traumas of World War II. We see that around us. Behind us, we see the courage. We see the struggle for humanity. Around us, we see these tyrants. And you can run through a long list of names. Start with Donald Trump, go through Benjamin Netanyahu, go through Recep Erdogan, go to Vladimir Putin, go to Rodrigo Duterte. There's a long list of them. And they carry on as though the world has no history and values don't matter. That's what we see around us right now. And looking ahead, we've got to say to successive generations, we want to encourage you to have the courage of the generation of the Nelson Mandelas, who took up the struggle for humanity, who understood how to build movements of solidarity, who understood what sacrifice was about, and who focused their eyes on a better world and understood that it can only come about by sacrifice and the building of solidarity. That's the moment we're in now, and I hope that we take the lessons not just of the past 100 years, but can look ahead with courage and mobilize a generation to say, never, never, and never again, because those were the words that Nelson Mandela used at his inauguration on the 11th of May, 1994. Thank you very much.